working with the municipality in this regard, going back to, I believe, 2004, which is when we completed the first development charges background study, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to be able to work with the municipality and in that capacity. And so, as mentioned in the introductory remarks, the purpose of... Yes?
Would you mind just giving us your name?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry about that. My name is Peter Simcisco, and I'm one of the managing partners with Watson & Associates.
Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. And so the purpose of today's presentation is to provide an overview of, or a little bit of background and context for what development charges are, go through some of the legislative changes that have taken place since the municipality last undertook its comprehensive development charges study back in 2019, go through some of the legislative context for the methodology that needs to be undertaken when undertaking this type of study, and then to also go through some of the policy considerations that get taken into account as part of the study process. So in terms of the structure, again, we're going to go through a brief overview and background on development charges. We're going to go through some development charge bylaw policies, and then we'll wrap up with a discussion of what the next steps in this process are going to be. So starting at the highest level in terms of what development charges are. So the purpose of development charges, which are a discretionary mechanism that's available to municipalities, and their purpose is to help recover the costs associated with the infrastructure expansion or service expansion that may be needed to accommodate future growth within a municipality. And really the purpose for their existence is to help protect existing taxpayers and ratepayers from bearing the burden of those costs, those investments that need to be made to expand service capacity. The capital costs that are recovered through the development charge mechanism recover the costs of items that are beyond what would be required as direct developer responsibility when they're constructing a subdivision. So there are a number of internal roads, water mains, wastewater mains, sidewalks that may be required directly of a developer as part of their subdivision agreement. So that's recovered directly in that regard. So development charges recover those broader costs. If there are downstream, for example, pipe oversizing required, widening of roads, expansion of municipal facilities such as recreation centers, for example, to again provide additional service capacity as the community grows. The legislative authority for imposing development charges is the Development Charges Act, which provides the framework for the process that has to be undertaken when determining development charges. So we'll spend quite a bit of time discussing that and how that has changed in recent years and how that impacts this process moving forward. And then finally, in terms of the current bylaw under which the municipality imposes development charges, that's bylaw 63/2019. So that's been in effect since 2019. And at the time that bylaw was put in place under the Development Charges Act, development charge bylaws had a maximum shelf life, if you will, of 5 years. And so that bylaw will be expiring on August 4th of this year. And so that's why we are undertaking this process now, to put the municipality in a position and council in a position to consider the approval of a new development charges bylaw in a couple of months. So as I mentioned earlier, the Development Charges Act has gone through several amendments in recent years. And what we've highlighted on the slide here is just a little bit of a timeline looking at all of the changes, more specifically the pieces of legislation, the acts that have amended various components of the Development Charges Act since the municipality last undertook the full background study, which was back in 2019. So firstly, we had Bill 108, the More Homes, More Choice Act, and associated with that, or closely related to that, were Bills 138 and Bills 197. And the major changes that occurred through those three bills were they fundamentally, first of all, reframed the context of the act. So prior to those changes, it was a very broad mechanism that allowed municipalities to recover these growth-related costs for any service except for a specific list of ineligible services. And with those three pieces of legislation, that was reframed, where the Development Charges Act, as a result, now only includes a defined list of services that are eligible for inclusion in the development charge bylaw. And we'll look at that full list of eligible services and what's being considered as part of this process later on in the presentation. And then the two other key changes that occurred through those first three items were changes to when the development charge is determined and when it is payable. So prior to Bill 108, development charges generally were calculated and became payable at the time a building permit was being issued. And in fact, the municipalities had the ability to withhold the issuance of a building permit until the development charge was paid in full. Municipalities did have the ability to enter into either early or deferred payment agreements on a case-by-case basis, but generally the default mechanism was to calculate the charge and receive payment at the time of building permit issuance. So the key changes through Bill 108 was, first of all, for developments that proceed through either a site plan process or a zoning bylaw amendment, their development charges became frozen in time at the rates that were in effect at the time that the planning application was submitted to the municipality. So even though the municipality may not have seen the building permit itself or the building permits related to that development until a couple of years down the road, the rates that they were paying were the rates that were in effect when that application was submitted to the municipality. The other key change was with respect to the timing of payment. So for certain types of development, including rental housing, institutional development, as well as not-for-profit housing, development charges were payable over certain number of years, over these annual installment payments. So as opposed to being payable right at building permit issuance, those developments were provided the opportunity to repay their development charges over 6 years. So those were some of the highlights of Bill 108 and a couple of the associated pieces of legislation. With Bill 213, that was more of not a change to the Development Charges Act directly, but a change to the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities Act, which exempted universities from the payment of development charges. So that became a statutory or mandatory exemption that had to be, from that point forward, observed by all municipalities. We then had Bill 109, which introduced some technical changes to the annual reporting requirements associated with development charges. And then we had a rather large or significant piece of legislation that came out last year. That was Bill 23, in 2022, rather, which introduced a number of important changes again. And so some of those changes were that from that point forward, municipalities were required to phase in any new development charge bylaw over a period of 5 years, where in the first year of a new bylaw, a municipality could charge a maximum of 80% of the full calculated charge, and then that went up by 5 percentage points each year until in year 5 of the bylaw, a municipality is finally able to charge the full calculated rates. So that was one of the key changes introduced in that regard. They also introduced some new exemptions for affordable housing units as well as attainable housing units. We just saw those affordable housing provisions coming into effect as of June 1st of this year, which was a recent announcement. We are still awaiting a definition of attainable housing and what that's going to mean, and as those will have to be exempt as well. Bill 23 also introduced a mandatory discount for rental housing units, where those rental housing units receive a discount from the development charge based on the number of bedrooms within the respective unit. So for example, for units with 3 or more bedrooms, they receive a 25% discount off of the development charge that would otherwise be payable, and that goes down where for units that have 1 bedroom or less, that discount is 15%. Bill 23 also removed growth-related studies from the list of capital costs that could be included in the development charge, which was a pretty significant change because oftentimes municipalities need to undertake a lot of studies, master planning type documents to understand what the impacts of growth within the community are going to be. And that goes both for the hard services of water, wastewater, and roads, but it also applies to things like library and fire, where oftentimes there are master plans undertaken to understand what those growth implications are going to be. And historically, municipalities had the ability to recover the costs related to those studies through the development charge, but Bill 23 removed that ability. And the other change through Bill 23 was the change to that maximum shelf life of development charge bylaws from what used to be 5 years historically to 10 years moving forward. So development charge bylaws can be in effect for up to 10 years moving forward. And also housing was removed as an eligible service through Bill 23. So through Bill 134, which was introduced late last year, we saw some changes to the definition of affordable housing units for the purposes of that mandatory exemption that has to be observed starting June 1st of this year, where they introduced so that affordability test used to be strictly with respect to market purchase prices or market rents. And through Bill 134, they refined that definition so that it also looks at income, or how much of the income the housing costs represent, either if it's a rental unit, how much the rent represents out of the gross income for a typical household, or specifically a household in the 60th income percentile. And for purchase prices, it did a similar test in that regard. And then just very recently, to round out the legislative changes, we saw the introduction of Bill 185, or Cutting Red Tape to Build More Homes Act, which effectively rolled back a number of the provisions introduced through Bill 23. So they are now proposing to remove that 5-year phase-in requirement again, so that municipalities do not need to phase in their development charge bylaws over a period of 5 years. And that was an interesting change in two regards. First of all, the 5-year phase-in applies currently to any new bylaw, whether the rates are going up or down. So even if a municipality recalculated the rates and found that the new rates are going to be lower than the rates that are currently in effect, they would still have to observe that 5-year phase-in. So it was a little bit strange in that regard. And the other component of it is that it resulted in big revenue shortfalls, potentially for municipalities, which now weren't able to recover the full extent of these growth-related costs through their development charge bylaws as a result of the phase-in. So again, Bill 185 is proposing to remove that 5-year phase-in requirement. They are also proposing to reduce the time that someone has to take a step back. So with the development charge freeze that I mentioned earlier, so developments proceeding through a site plan or zoning bylaw amendment process, again, they have their development charges frozen in time, but there is a 2-year time limit on from the time the planning application is approved to the time of building permit issuance for that development charge freeze to apply. So the province has now, through Bill 185, proposed to reduce that time limit down to 18 months. And then the third major change is through Bill 185, they are proposing to reinstate growth-related studies as a development charge eligible cost. So again, most of these changes are deemed to be positive for municipalities in that regard, as they are rolling back some of the provisions that were introduced through Bill 23, which many municipalities had some concerns with. And so all of these legislative changes are being reflected in the study that we're currently undertaking. Again, just wanted to make you aware of some of the significant changes that have occurred since the last study was undertaken in 2019. And because Bill 185 hasn't yet received royal assent, it's currently out for public consultation. We are going to be responding to some of those changes as we finalize the study and the development charge calculations. So I'll touch on that a little bit again when we get to the next steps, just so that there's awareness of how that might impact the process moving forward. So in this next section, I'd like to just walk through the methodology that has to be followed in establishing a development charge. There's a lot of detail in the illustration here, so don't worry too much about what's in the individual boxes. I'll walk through it at a slightly higher level. And again, this has been designed in line with the requirements of the Development Charges Act, which is quite prescriptive in terms of what the content of the background study has to be. So the process commences by looking at what is the anticipated amount of growth within a municipality. And we need to look at both the amount as well as the type and location of growth within a municipality. So that's the green box at the very top. Once we understand that amount of growth that's expected, and where we can look at that amount of growth over a 10-year period, we can look at it over a longer term growth horizon as well, as the case may be. And once we've established what that anticipated amount of development is going to be, we're looking at the estimated increase in need for service that's going to arise as a result of that growth. So we're looking at, is there going to be a shortage of treatment capacity, for example, that's going to result as a result of that development? Are we going to need to expand recreational amenities or park space to respond to that growth and to really be able to maintain service levels? So once we've looked at what that increase in need for service is going to be, we have to measure that increase in need for service relative to the level of service that's been provided in the municipality over the past 15 years. And the intent of that test is to make sure that the development charge doesn't become a mechanism that allows a municipality to increase its levels of service. It's meant to be a mechanism that allows the municipality to make the investments needed to keep a steady level of service as the community grows. And we have to look at that historical level of service from both a quantitative and a qualitative standpoint. So we're typically looking at, for example, how much recreational facility space has been provided in the municipality per capita over the past 15 years on average, and making sure that what's proposed through to be funded through the development charge mechanism wouldn't result in an increase to that level of service. So once we've measured that, we also need to make sure that any increase in need for service that's being identified for inclusion in the development charge, there's a indication from council that those needs will be met. So it's meant to ensure that this doesn't become a wish list that's conceived of as part of the development charge study process. We are capturing in the development charges background study the needs that have been embraced through various master plans, previous development charge studies, capital plans, and so on. So that's another important test that we have to meet. So once we've established that estimated increase in need for service in general terms, we are then looking at specific development charge projects or needs by service. So we're identifying those specific investments or projects that would have to be undertaken to meet that increase in need for service. So again, as an example, if we identify that there's some additional water treatment capacity that would be required to make sure that further development can be accommodated, we're then trying to identify what specific projects would need to be undertaken. Is that a treatment plant expansion, for example, or some other project to ensure that that capacity is put in place? So once we have that list of projects, we are then looking at the costs associated with undertaking those projects. And so that gives us the capital costs that get included in the calculation of the charge. And then moving down the illustration, as illustrated with the three orange or yellow boxes towards the bottom, there are several deductions that we have to observe, most notably to the extent that any individual project would result in a benefit to the existing community. We have to deduct that proportionate share of the project cost. So as an example, if we've identified a new recreational facility, it's going to be a larger facility, but it's also going to replace an existing recreational facility. So that portion of the new facility that's replacing the existing floor area would be deducted as a benefit to existing, because that would have happened through the life cycle replacement of the existing facility anyhow. So that's one example of that benefit to existing deduction. Then we also have to reduce those capital costs by any grants or subsidies or other external contributions that the municipality is expecting to receive to help offset some of those capital costs. So again, most typically that would be grants, and if there's some grant funding secured for those projects, that would have to be deducted as well. So ultimately, once we make those deductions, we are left with the net capital costs that are included in the calculation of the charge. And then we calculate a charge for different types of development, which I'll touch on the next slide in a little bit more detail. And in addition to that mathematical part of the equation, we also take into account various policy considerations as part of the study process as well, which are then reflected in the respective bylaw. So we're looking at things like, what's the spatial applicability of the bylaw? Is this going to apply on a municipal-wide basis? Is it going to be, or at least for some services, applicable on a more of an area-specific basis? A good example of that being water, wastewater services, for which the municipality only charges in the urban serviced areas that actually have access to those services. So that could be looked at as an area-specific service in that regard. We also look at whether there are any exemptions that the municipality wishes to grant from the payment of development charges on top of those statutory exemptions that I mentioned earlier, as just a few examples. So with that said, on the next slide here, we have a summary of the development charges that are currently in effect. Again, a lot of numbers on the slide. I just wanted to point out that ultimately the charges that municipalities have in their bylaws are typically expressed on the residential side of things as a charge per residential unit for different types of residential units. And the reason there are these different charges is to reflect the different levels of occupancy that these different types of units have. So because apartment units typically have fewer occupants on average than a single detached home, the corresponding charges is lower as well, because they place a lower service demand on municipal services. So that's where we see that differentiation of the charge by type of unit. And then on the non-residential side of things, typically the charge is expressed as a charge per unit of gross floor area, in this case per square foot of building space in that regard. You will also note on the far right-hand side of the table that there are two different charges for, one set of charges for industrial development, and then for all other non-residential development. So this is a policy that the municipality has had in place historically, whereby industrial development is exempted partially from the payment of development charges, where they're only paying the water and wastewater components of the charge. And that's a policy that we'll come back to a little bit later in the presentation. So the next part here is the draft growth forecast that has been prepared, that as part of that first step of the process of, again, understanding the amount, type, and location of growth within a municipality. So this growth forecast has been developed to align with the Northumberland County Municipal Comprehensive Review that was prepared in I believe towards the end of 2021, which is informing the county's official plan update, and has allocations for all the area municipalities within that as well. And so you'll see that we have two distinct planning horizons identified in the chart here. We have a 10-year planning horizon looking out to 2034, and over that time frame, we're expecting the municipality's population to grow by about 3,385 people. And we're expecting that population growth to be accommodated in approximately 1,672 dwelling units of different types. In terms of the non-residential sector, we are expecting a job growth of about 734 additional jobs within the community over that time frame, and that would be associated with about 756,000 square feet of building space to accommodate that employment growth as well. We have also identified a longer-term planning horizon, which is the second line from the bottom, so 2024 to build out. And that build out forecast refers to the build out of the designated urban areas within the existing urban boundary. So there's potential for growth even beyond that, but that's how build out has been defined in this case. I would note, however, that in terms of looking at the capital needs that we're identifying through the development charges background study, we are really looking at that 10-year planning horizon for all services at this point. So looking out at what those capital needs would be to service that population and employment growth to 2034. So in this next section, just want to go through, first of all, identifying the development charge eligible services. As I mentioned earlier, the Act now has a very specific defined list of the services that can be included in a development charges study and the development charge rates. So the list on this slide is the comprehensive list of services that could be considered, and what we have highlighted with the teal color are the services that are being considered as part of the municipality's development charges background study. So we have the hard services of water and wastewater, as well as services related to a highway. So that's your roads and related infrastructure, as well as the public works assets associated with that. There are the costs of policing that are imposed in certain areas of the municipality as well that are not serviced by the OPP contract. We have costs related to fire services, library, parks and recreation, and then Provincial Offences Act as well. So this is bylaw enforcement and the extent to which that might need to expand as, again, the community grows. So that highlights the services that are being considered as part of this process. And then, having looked at the list of services, the next slide here summarizes the capital costs that can be included in the calculation of the charge. So on the left-hand side, we have the costs that are eligible for inclusion. So these are costs to acquire land or an interest in land, improvements that may need to be made to the land, for example, for parks, implementing amenities on parkland, for example, as well as costs to construct facilities or improve facilities, costs related to purchasing equipment and fleet items as well to provide additional service capacity, as well as any capital components of leases related to these items. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a purchase of an item. It could be a capital lease as well. Additionally, circulation materials for libraries are included as an eligible cost as well, even though they may not be capital in the traditional sense of the word, but recognizing that the library might need to expand its collection materials to provide a stable level of service as the community grows, that's eligible as well. And then municipalities also have the ability to include interest that they're paying on if there's borrowing that's taken out to pay for any of these capital needs. The interest costs related to that borrowing can be included in the calculation of the charge as well. There are a few notable exclusion from the list of eligible capital costs. So first of all, any costs related to the acquisition of land for parks, that's ineligible, and that's because there are provisions under the Planning Act that give municipalities the ability to secure either lands directly or receive payments in lieu of parkland for that in that regard. So we cannot recover the cost of acquiring park land within the development charge. We can, however, include the cost related to improving that land. So again, implementing parkland amenities, fencing, playground equipment, that sort of thing on the parkland, that is development charge eligible. Vehicles and equipment that have a useful life of less than 7 years, those are ineligible from inclusion in the development charge, as well as broadly computer equipment is not an eligible cost. And more recently, studies, as I mentioned earlier, have been excluded from that list, pending some changes potentially in the near future. And then the Development Charges Act does give the province the ability to remove land from being an eligible cost as well for other services, although they haven't yet introduced any such restrictions. So having talked about the growth component and then the services that are eligible and the specific capital costs that we can include as part of any of those services, the next part of the presentation just looks at some of the policies surrounding the Development Charges Bylaw. Firstly, on this slide here, we have a summary of the exemption policies, which include discounts from the payment of development charges. So on the left-hand side of the slide, we have a full list of the statutory or mandatory exemptions that each municipality has to observe within its development charge bylaw. So any industrial expansion or expansion of an industrial building up to 50% of the existing gross floor area is fully exempt from the payment of development charges. Again, these apply to all municipalities. Residential intensification, with the meaning of adding additional residential units within existing residential buildings or ancillary to existing residential buildings, are exempt, subject to some maximums. Generally, any municipal entities, the county, as well as any school board developments are fully exempt from the development charges, as well as, again, additional residential units. There have been some new or additional mandatory deductions and exemptions that have been introduced through the various recent pieces of legislation. So historically, the additional residential units were only exempt if they were being created in an existing home, for example. So if someone had a single detached house and added to a basement apartment, maybe an addition, that was exempt. That exemption was recently extended to also apply to newly built dwellings as well. So someone can build a single detached home with 2 accessory apartments, where those accessory apartments are fully exempt from the development charge. As mentioned earlier, again, affordable and attainable housing units will be fully exempt starting June 1st. Not-for-profit housing is fully exempt. Universities are exempt from development charges. We talked about the 5-year phase-in, the rental housing discount, as well as the development charge rate freeze for developments proceeding through either site plan or zoning bylaw amendment application. So in addition to all those statutory exemptions, again, municipalities have the ability to exempt other entities from the payment of development charges as well. And so the municipalities' existing exemption policies are listed on the right-hand side of the table here. So firstly, any development associated with places of worship or churchyards, cemeteries, is exempt from the payment of development charges. Secondly, the construction of buildings for farm use related to bona fide farming operations are fully exempt from development charges, as well as buildings used for hospitals. And so those first 3 exemptions are very common across the province that many municipalities recognize in their development charge bylaws. And then the fourth one is a partial exemption, as again mentioned earlier, whereby any industrial development is only paying the water and wastewater components of the development charge. There are many municipalities in the province that fully exempt industrial. There are also others that charge industrial the full rates. Again, that's a policy consideration that we look at as part of the study process. So the next item here in terms of policies are redevelopment credits. So this is something that isn't statutorily required in the Act, but is something that's typically recognized by municipalities, is that where there's a redevelopment of a property. So for example, someone demolishes a single detached home and builds a row of townhouses on the same property. So we would calculate the development charges payable on those townhouse units, but then we would recognize a credit for the single detached home that previously existed on the property, recognizing that there's just some incremental service demand that's going to generate, but not necessarily for the full extent of the townhouses that are being created. The municipality's current development charge bylaw provides for a 4-year time limit for that credit to be observed from the time of demolition to the redevelopment. That is something that we're going to be looking to adjust to 5 years to better align that with the county's policies. So just a minor technical change in that regard. Now, recognizing that the development charge is calculated at a point in time, and recognizing that certainly costs escalate over time, especially with what we've seen in recent years, the Development Charges Act does give municipalities the ability to adjust the development charge rates using a prescribed index. That's the non-residential construction price index that's been in the Act for many years. And so currently the policy is to adjust the municipality's development charges once per year, and that occurs on January 1st using that index. We are going to be taking a look at that policy specifically, and potentially, if the 5-year phase-in of development charges continues to be applicable, as we're passing the new bylaws, potentially changing that indexation date to align with the date when the charges will hit the next level of the phase-in, just to make that a little bit easier to administer. If, however, Bill 185 passes before then, before we pass the new bylaw, we are going to be sticking with January 1st, as that is a good point in time, again, administratively to index the charges. So that summarizes some of the key policy considerations. Again, we'll be able to revisit that in a little bit more detail as we get into the public meeting process. So the final component here is I'd like to touch on are the next steps. So we are going to be publishing the development charges background study. That's the full technical document on the municipality's website on May 9th, which is this coming Thursday. There is a kind of hard deadline for that to happen because the background study has to be published at least 60 days prior to council considering approval of a new bylaw. And because we've set out July 9th as that date when the bylaw will come forward for council consideration, working back from there, May 9th is the date we have to release the background study. That doesn't mean that if there are changes required as a result of the public consultation process or council's review of those documents, we can still make changes to the background study via an addendum without impacting the overall timeline. So just wanted to note that. And as part of that background study that will be published on Thursday, that will contain the new or updated draft bylaws as well. One of the changes that I didn't mention earlier, but that you'll notice once that background study is made public, is that as of right now, we are proposing that the municipality imposes the charges for each service area under a separate bylaw. So historically, all charges were encompassed in a single bylaw. The reason for that change was in response to the 5-year phase-in requirement, because every time a bylaw is reopened, that 5-year phase-in is triggered. But it is possible that from time to time, at least one of the components of the charge may need to be reviewed. For example, let's say the municipality undertakes a comprehensive water wastewater master plan a couple of years from now, realizes that the capital needs identified through that master plan vary significantly from what was identified at this point in time, and wishes to recalculate the water wastewater development charges. If all the charges are in the same bylaw, once it's updated with the updated water wastewater charges, the 5-year phase-in will kick in for all rates, right? So to kind of mitigate that, imposing separate bylaws for each service, if you are reopening just that one charge, let's say it's the water component of the charge, the phase-in would only kick in for that component of the charge. Now, with that all said, of course, if Bill 185 passes or comes into effect prior to the council consideration these new bylaws, we will be recommending collapsing them back into just one bylaw because it's all just being done in response to the phase-in requirement. So we're keeping a close eye on Bill 185 and how it proceeds through the legislature. And again, we may need to make some changes to what's going to be in this background study that you will see on Thursday. So I wanted to highlight that as one of the potential changes, as well as the studies. So the background study that you will see come out on Thursday is not going to include any of the growth-related studies because they are not currently an eligible cost. However, we are working with staff to identify those studies proactively so that as soon as Bill 185 receives royal assent, we can roll those studies into the development charge calculation as well. So again, if Bill 185 comes into force ahead of council considering these new bylaws for adoption, there will be an addendum issued to the background study to bring those studies in at that point in time. And I think and then we would be removing the phase-in provision from the bylaws, of course, as well, if that gets removed. So one other milestone after the publishing of the background study is June 18th. We are required to hold at least one public meeting to hear comments from the public on these matters. So that's been set for June 18th. Where we will present an overview of the development charges study and the rates and policies that are captured in the bylaws. And then finally, the final step of the way is on July 9th, we would expect council to be in a position to consider adoption of the new bylaws, either plural or a single bylaw, if Bill 185 comes into force before then. If Bill 185 doesn't come into force ahead of July 9th, if it comes into force at some point after that, then we would potentially be undertaking an amendment after that point in time. And so that concludes the formal part of the presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that very informative presentation. I'm going to turn it over to your colleagues for some questions, but maybe I'll just kick off and ask you, what is the methodology that's used to determine the anticipated growth of any municipality?
So in terms of identifying the growth, it's not the role of the development charges study to necessarily identify what the growth targets for a municipality are. The growth forecast developed as part of the development charge background study is really looking at various approved official plans or similar types of documents. So that's why in terms of the overall targets that we're looking at which I believe the county's work looked out to 2051, that provides an overall target of growth for the municipality. And then we're trying to just understand how that's likely to roll out within the first 10 years versus the longer term forecast horizon. But in terms of the targets, those are typically set out in approved official plans or other similar types of documents.
And just one other question, maybe to inspire more questioning. As I was looking at the list of exemptions, it seems to me that municipalities are in some ways penalized if they're focusing on things like attainable and affordable housing and more rental units in a community. So my question then becomes, if in our strategic plans we are focusing on more homes in those particular areas to increase affordability, who then pays for the services that are still required to be delivered in our municipality?
So in that example, as is the case with any exemption or discount, the Act is very specific in saying that any reduction in the charge that's provided for one type of development cannot be made up for by increasing the charges for other types of development. So any revenue shortfall resulting from such a policy by incentivizing, for example, the development of affordable, attainable homes would need to come from the tax base or the ratepayers.
Councillor Mink?
Thank you. So through the chair, I have two questions. One question is about the, sorry, let me get the right term here. The redevelopment credits and that 4-year time limit, which is going to change to a 5-year time limit. That is, to my understanding, and please clarify, that is the property itself. It's not the owner. Is that correct?
Correct.
So is there any ability in the bylaw that we create that So my concern is that if somebody tears down a building and sits on it for whatever reason, there could be multiple reasons why they can't develop. The property, the inflation, recession, disaster, pandemic, whatever. They can't develop this property, so the clock is ticking. And then they sell it potentially to a new person that has no time to build. Is there any way to create a bylaw around that and extend that date at all?
That's a really good question. I think that's something we can certainly look at. We can work with staff to look at other similar policies that maybe have been implemented elsewhere. Again, typically there's a desire to put a time constraint on it to make sure that that redevelopment happens in a reasonable amount of time. And if it doesn't, then effectively that capacity becomes free for someone else to use, right? So, but I understand your point about there could be circumstances that prevented someone from redeveloping within that time frame, and so how can we capture that within the bylaw or some associated policy? So certainly something we can look further into.
Okay, thank you. And then the second question is in regards to the parkland and the acquisition of parkland may not be included. So the scenario that I have that I'm thinking about is we have a rural hamlet that has a lot of development coming. It's very removed from the urban area. It's probably the most removed geographically. So far, I've seen 5 sort of draft plans at different stages. None of those draft plans include parkland, where we would get cash in lieu. And I'm not too sure if there's a requirement that cash in lieu must stay in that community or if it can go anywhere for parkland. We have another development potentially coming in that area, which is the biggest of all. So this community could be quite substantial with no parkland at all. And if that cash in lieu for parkland can go elsewhere, how do we work around giving that community the required parkland that they need if we can't buy it and it's not included in the draft plans?
So I think that's something that would be within the jurisdiction of the parkland dedication policies to determine how those funds get used. Again, to my knowledge, and not being familiar with the municipality's parkland dedication policy, I don't believe there are typically restrictions on where that money needs to be used. It's quite broad in that regard. But certainly there would be a desire to ensure that parkland is developed in areas that are in some proximity to the development that's occurring. But there's no policy necessarily, to my knowledge, that requires that, right? So it's not something that we could address through the development charge mechanism. The development charge just looks at where there are identified parkland development needs and the related costs, and how do we finance those through a development charge. It doesn't have the ability to impose restrictions as to where that money is spent specifically.
Yes, Councillor Todd.
Thank you. When creating the draft bylaws, what consideration, if any, is given to some of the documents we have in place, like climate action plans and economic development plans, in order to either create some of the discretionary or put some incentives in? Do you folks taking that in consideration as you go through it?
We would certainly. So in discussions with staff as we go through the process, we have the discussion of typically starting with this is the existing list of exemptions within the bylaw, and are there any additional ones that we should consider adding? And now I think we've seen municipalities to some extent shift away from having exemptions directly in the bylaw and introducing grant programs through a CIP, a community improvement plan, because it gives a municipality more and council more control over where those grants are provided, right, on an application basis. Because once an exemption is in a development charge bylaw, it has to be observed for any development. So it doesn't have that foresight to see, is this meeting our broader policy objectives? Whereas through the CIP program, that can be addressed more head on.
Yes, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. That was a good segue. My question is about stormwater. I noticed on slide 11, it's not highlighted in blue as one of the ones that's being reviewed as part of this study. So I was curious to understand why that's not being reviewed, given that flooding and stormwater management is one of the has been identified as one of the more significant impacts of climate change that we're going to be experiencing in our ecosystem here. And I also wanted to understand why stormwater is not currently being applied to industrial development. So stormwater infrastructure is part of DCs.
Stormwater is an interesting one in that oftentimes the infrastructure required is very localized and would be direct developer responsibility. Now, to the extent that there might be some downstream improvements to facilitate higher stormwater flows through the pipe network, those could potentially be included. So at this point, we haven't identified the need for any oversizing of stormwater infrastructure that would qualify in that regard. And again, oftentimes the stormwater controls tend to be development specific, whether it's a retention pond or similar types of infrastructure. So they would be borne directly by the developer. So it's fairly uncommon to see stormwater included in the development charge bylaw. But again, to the extent that there might be some downstream infrastructure upgrades that could potentially be looked at. So that hopefully addresses the question of why we haven't yet. We have talked about we put up the full list of services and established or picked off the ones that we have an understanding of some growth related needs within, and stormwater wasn't one of those areas at this point in time. Again, maybe that's something that if addressed through a future water, wastewater, stormwater master plan or a similar type of undertaking, it could be rolled in at that point in time.
Councillor Less.
Yes, thank you. Great presentation. And I was going over slide number 8, the schedule of development charges. And I was trying to make the rationale between an apartment with less than 1 bedroom or less than 2 bedrooms, which could be a single bedroom or it could be a studio, and a special dwelling unit, which could be a tiny home in that area. And I would like to see maybe a little more thought being put into dwellings where there's only going to be a person in there and equalize it, whether it be a studio, a small 1 bedroom, or a tiny home, and bring those charges closer together.
So certainly something that we can look into. That special care, special dwelling unit is intended to capture typically units in institutional environments, so a long-term care home or a retirement residence, where typically the occupancy would be limited to 1 person on average. Whereas the category for apartments of less than 2 bedrooms, which currently includes both 1 bedroom as well as bachelor apartments, we could potentially further differentiate between 1 bedroom versus bachelor apartments in the calculation. That could be done.
Thank you. And how does this apply to additional residential units?
So additional residential units are generally exempt under the intensification of residential housing exemptions. So up to, for example, a single detached home, someone can add up to 2 additional dwelling units, for example, 1 in the basement, 1 on top of a detached garage. Both of those units would be exempt. So there's a limit of 2 additional dwelling units, but they are fully exempt statutorily under the Development Charges Act.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I have one, but you go ahead, Deputy Mayor.
I also had a question about the vehicles. So I know there was a note that vehicles with a expected life of less than 7 years are not eligible. What about vehicles with a longer shelf life? So if we needed, for example, a new snowplow in order to maintain service levels and service a new development, are those eligible for DCs?
Yes, absolutely. And just to qualify that as well, so for good example would be police vehicles, right? So police vehicles tend to get used around the clock. So we look at that useful life limitation as for a vehicle that's operated on a typical full day shift. So a police vehicle, even though it might have a use, they may get replaced every, let's say, 5 years. I'm not sure if that's the right number, but let's say it's 5 years. But recognizing that they are used 24 hours a day, if they weren't and were used on an 8-hour shift, they would have a useful life of 10 plus years potentially. So we do take that into account as well.
So I had the same question about the eligible, because of the police vehicles, I know having far less than a 7-year life course typically. I wanted to go back to something that Councillor Todd was asking, just about the flexibility and what those charges can be used for, what kind of flexibility we can have built into the bylaw. In particular, the list of eligible services. It strikes me that some of those are obviously the more traditional services, some additional ones are being considered. But given that we are in a climate crisis, given that the nature of needs of any communities are shifting and changing at a pretty rapid rates these days, is this an exhaustive list? If it's not an exhaustive list, how far can we push the flexibility within a bylaw of having that sort of bucket of money for things that we can anticipate now but might be a thing in 5 years from now?
So at the moment, the way the Development Charges Act is written, it is really it's restricted to this list. So that's where there was a change since 2019 when the municipality last undertook a development charge study, where before there was a list of ineligible services, and everything else, potentially including some provisions for unknown items, could be looked at as well. As you know, the requirements right now are this is the list of eligible services, and we have to look at only the capital costs within those definitions.
Councillor Todd.
At the risk of getting granular, simply because of the nature of our community, erosion mitigation, floodwater planning, stuff like that, how does that fit in? Like, does that fit in along the parkland upgrades? Like, where does stuff like that fit if we were to try and apply money?
I think for that, we would have to look at the specific measures. And if there's a list that you have in mind, we could potentially take a look at that item by item to see if we can relate it to potentially stormwater. And if we can relate it to stormwater, then potentially that could be included. So again, I think it would be more of a project by project consideration.
So just a quick follow-up to that. So these are set in stone, but are the definitions of them set in stone, or are these sort of essentially contested ideas and concepts?
These services are not defined in the Act, no. So they are subject to some interpretation.
Deputy Mayor.
Okay, this is maybe a more complicated question. Is there a way to include in the calculations for development charges not only the new services that are required, so that there's an equal enjoyment of services with the new development, but what about any expenses that are going to be incurred in order to maintain the level of service for existing residents that could be negatively impacted by the new development? And I want to use examples like road surfacing that needs to be replaced at an earlier date than, say, the asset management plan expects because of increased traffic on that road, the need for additional stop signs or traffic lights to move traffic around in an existing neighborhood that's a result of overflow from the new neighborhood. Impacts, say, which we're experiencing here to a new development of, removal of a significant number of trees that is now creating impacts in an existing neighborhood. Is there a way to look at those anticipated impacts and include those in the development charges as well?
Potentially, if there was typically through a master planning type exercise, or maybe a road need study to the example of roads that would quantify the extent of accelerated deterioration of the road surfaces as a result of increased traffic volumes, that could be looked at. I think it's a common example of something that's included in a development charge study is where a municipality needs to upgrade road surfaces from, let's say, surface treated to asphalt, or from gravel in some cases to surface treatment, because the traffic volumes are going to exceed a point at which that makes more sense operationally. So those types of upgrades, because they're triggered by growth, can be partially included in a development charge. It gets a little bit trickier with trying to make the determination of how much quicker the assets are deteriorating. But if that was quantified through some kind of engineering assessment, for example, we could potentially look at including that to some extent as well.
Thank you. And just going back to the point that you were making about exemptions, what happens if in that example that you gave of 2 additional units, instead of there's one person per unit, that you get 2 additional families that are in those spaces, and everybody along that street decides that they're going to follow suit in that same way. Is it reasonable to assume that there aren't going to be additional strains on services, or that those should necessarily be exempt from any kind of charges?
I think certainly there would be additional demands on the services. It's just under the, and in terms of the engineering assessments or infrastructure assessments that are undertaken, they would look at that overall growth, right? So they don't necessarily look at what built form that growth is going to occur in, whether it's going to be accessory apartments or new dwelling units. It's just there will be additional population, additional water demands, for example, additional traffic flows, and there will be infrastructure upgrades required as a result. So certainly we can identify those costs. However, under the Development Charges Act, the municipality cannot charge those additional residential units. So it's a statutory exemption. So even though, yes, they do create additional service demands, and there's a real cost associated with that, we cannot recover that through a development charge.
Thank you. Yes, I think final question maybe, Deputy Mayor?
I think, the mayor asked probably one of the most important questions at the outset about who then pays for the costs of the additional servicing required when we expand affordable housing and attainable housing in our community, which we are mandated to do, but also have identified as a community priority. And so I'm not asking that question again. What I am asking is, it's interesting that where there have been more controversial elements of these previous bills, they are now looking at rolling back some of those provisions that were not very well received from Bill 23. You mentioned the 5-year phase-in period, as well as, what was the other one? The can't remember off the top of my head, and I can't read my notes without my glasses. But the question I have is, do you have an understanding of why those changes are now being made? So what was effective, I guess, in the feedback, say, that municipalities and our associations provided that resulted in the government relooking at those elements? I'm asking because obviously the affordable housing piece is a gap or perhaps a problematic element that might need to be addressed in the future.
I think it was just that, as you mentioned, it was the communication piece. I know that there have been a lot of municipalities communicating directly to the province. Certainly the firms that are involved in this type of work, ourselves included, were communicating those concerns to the province, as were some of the associations and organizations representing the municipal sector as well. So I think it was through I can only guess and assume that it was through that feedback that they kept receiving, even well past when the bill came into force, that they decided to respond to that.
Thank you very much. Seeing no more questions, the recommended action is to receive the presentation for information. Can I get a mover and seconder? Moved by Councillor Less, second by Councillor Adam. All in favor? Thank you very much. We're moving on to item number 4, the confirmatory bylaw. It is now time for the confirmatory bylaw. This bylaw confirms the proceedings that took place this evening and provides a formal adoption through a bylaw. Can I get a mover and seconder? Moved by Councillor Adams, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. All in favor? That's passed unanimously. This concludes our business to be covered on today's agenda. We've reached the end, and I'm in a position to adjourn the meeting. Thank you, and we'll be reconvening for our council meeting at 6:30 p.m. Thank you.